not true that anything that someone does can't be an externality on themselves, or what we call an internality. And the reason that there can be internalities is that individuals often neglect, ignore, or impose inefficiently costs on themselves, especially on their future selves. And these are called externalities, and policies trying to address them, rather than being called externality policy, are called paternalism. So it's basically the same idea as in the market. There are certain things that aren't taken into account correctly. And there are large areas of policy that are determined by these. So if you think about it, all the policies we have about dealing with addictive substances, drug abuse, and so forth, are all based on the idea that people don't take into account the harms that they're causing themselves, right? Most people in society at large think addicts would be better off if they quit, but yet they don't quit, right? And this justifies having sin taxes, prohibitions of certain drugs, and so forth. Another example of this is forced savings and Social Security. Many policies force people to save for retirement, and the idea is that we think that people are tempted not to save enough, and that they'd be better off if they saved more. Another example is energy efficiency standards, or CAFE standards, which require that the fuel mileage on the average of a corporate fleet of cars has to be high enough. And most economists would say it's better just to put on an energy tax. Why are you monkeying around in specifically with the energy efficiency of these cars? And what Alcott and Wozny argue is that consumers don't respond enough to the energy savings on their cars. They just don't take into account the fact that if they buy a more efficient car, they're going to save a lot of money, and therefore it's better for them actually to be forced to buy a more fuel efficient car. And in fact, what they found was that the benefit to the people themselves of buying the more efficient cars is much larger than the benefit to the environment of them buying the more efficient cars. In fact, it's almost an order of magnitude bigger, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. Similarly, we prohibit people from committing suicide, from donating their organs, or being paid to donate organs, or being paid to be prostitutes, or something like that. And I think the reason for a lot of those things is we think that it's bad for them in ways that they don't fully appreciate. So here's the example of the Wozny and Alcott data. So what they looked at was how much an increase in a car's fuel economy, holding the car fixed, causes people to buy the car. And this is how much more they should be willing to pay for the car as the fuel economy increases. But here's what they would do if they actually took into account the full amount that they were spending. And so people basically should be willing to pay about $500 less for a really inefficient car, and about $500 more for a really efficient car than they're actually willing to, given the amount that they're going to have to spend on energy for such an inefficient car. Another very difficult case of externalities is what's called the happy child problem. So imagine that there was a net externality to all currently living people of you having a child that was zero. That is, there would be some benefits to the world. They might invent something great. They might, and so forth. But there would also be some costs, greater crowding, more pollution, etc. On average, it was nothing. So there's no benefit or cost to currently living people if you having a child. And imagine that this child will have a good, happy life. And you are completely indifferent as to whether to have a child as well. So is there any inefficiency to be corrected here? Should there be a subsidy on you having the child or not? Sung Ho, what do you think?
I think it depends on whether that marginal child, like what that marginal child brings to the society as, like if it's.
What I'm saying is it brings nothing to society, either positive or negative. Rest of society completely doesn't care.
Well,
right?
Then I don't think there's wrong of having. Yeah.
Do you think it should be subsidized? Do you think it should be taxed, or nothing at all?
Nothing at all either.
What do you think, Ben?
Well, I don't know, but does that $0 take into account a child will have a good, happy life? Because no, it doesn't. Society
No, it doesn't.
do that at all.
It doesn't.
So
we only said to all currently living people.
So like the utility derived, you have to sort of like measure the utility derived from the child will have a good, happy life.
Yeah, that's the problem. Is that positive? Is that negative? What is the child willing to pay to be brought into the world? So, I don't have a good answer to this question, and in fact, it's one of the hardest questions in philosophy. So basically, no one has a good answer to this question. But it's something you should think about, because it makes a huge difference. Because there's all sorts of policies that affect who gets brought into the world, and if those things cause positive or negative externalities, we should really think about that, right? Here's another question. So, when you drive drunk on the road, is there an externality to others that are in the car with you? Is there an externality to others who are on the road but aren't in the car with you? Is there an externality on internality on yourself? Is there an externality on your family and those who depend on you? Is there an externality to the children that you might have in the future and you might cause never to come into the world as a result of having killed yourself? So, the key question is there something which you should be taking into account that you're not taking into account? So, for example, if you take into account because your friends won't like you as much as afterwards or something like that, the harms that you're going to cause to other people by drunk driving and getting into an accident, then you're not causing externalities to other people in the car. On the other hand, if you're drunk driving and you sort of don't care what they think, even if they chose to get into the car with you voluntarily, you're causing an externality to them. On the road, you're almost certainly causing an externality to everyone because you're not taking into account the effects you have on them. Is there an internality on yourself? Well, it depends on when you're drunk. Are you taking into account the harm that you're going to cause to your future self by getting into an accident? On the family, it depends how much you care about your family. If you care enough about your family to take that into consideration and weigh that against all the other things that are leading you to get drunk before you drive, then there's no externality. But if you're not, then there is an externality. And this all depends on your answer to the happy child problem, which, yeah, Anthony.
Could you repeat the explanation for like the externality to others in the car?
Well, so imagine that the other people had to get into, we're going to get into the car because they basically have no other way to get home.
Oh.
So here's a classic example. So, I don't know if anyone knows about the story of like the day when the music died, when Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper all got into a flight with a pilot who was drunk and ended up crashing them into the ground. Now, they could have instead, and in fact they have this choice, gotten onto a bus and driven to the next place, but it would have taken forever, it was incredibly cold, etc. So they instead got into this plane. Now, they knew the guy was drunk, and they got into the plane with him anyways, but still, they would have been much better off if he hadn't gotten drunk. And when he decided to get drunk, he didn't take into account the fact that it would make them worse off, right? And so, if he'd taken that into account and balanced that off against all the other things, that would have been no externality. But even if the person has a choice of whether to go or not, you can still be causing them an externality. It's sort of like, everybody else had a choice to get onto the road the night when you were drunk driving, right? And you clearly caused an externality to them. So it's not an issue of choice or not choice, it's a question of what is taken into account when you make your decisions. Yeah, Max?
So, in the case of the plane crash, he was basically doing service for them. They're paying him to fly the plane. So if a provider, say, of a service, doesn't, for some reason, let's say an error in judgment, doesn't provide that service, so that's an externality.
So that's a great point, what you just said, Max. So what you just said makes a lot of sense. So imagine that he was charging them a price, and that the price that he was able to charge them went down as a result of him being drunk. Then there would be no externality. But because he was doing it for free, there was an externality, because that didn't give them an incentive to take into account the reduction in their value that they would get from that. Yeah, Anthony?
So basically, if they can get in the car for free, they basically own the right to ride in the car, and the guy getting drunk decreases their value of the right to
That's the right way to think about it, yeah. So, another thing that makes this even more complicated is that think about your future self, yourself in 50 years. Are you really, imagine that you're about to have a child. Is yourself in 50 years really that much more closely related to you than your child is? Well, maybe not. I mean, that's really distant, and you might have a whole different set of beliefs and a whole different set of views. So it's not that obvious that you're going to look out for the interests of yourself in 50 years any more than you would look out for the interests of this child that you might potentially have. Because yourself in 50 years might or might not exist depending on the actions you take today, just like the child that you might have might or might not exist. So when we think about things within an individual, when we think about things across individuals, we have to deal, even though it's very hard, with these very difficult philosophical questions. So, for example, should there be a tax on having reckless sex that might cause you to get an STD? That has bad effects on your future self. You might look out for that just as poorly as you look out for your potential child, etc., etc. These are difficult questions, and reasonable people can have different views on them. Okay, so most economists' favorite response to externalities or internalities or whatever you want to call these things is to have a tax on the harmful activity, or if it's a beneficial activity, to subsidize it. And the subsidies usually even come through the tax system. You get like a tax credit or something like this. And this is a simple solution because it directly creates a price for the activities that didn't have a price. And the tax should always be equal to the marginal externality at the optimal level. Otherwise, it's not going to play the same role of price, right? Price is always equal to the marginal cost that you're imposing. But the problem is, setting something equal to the marginal externality is not a sufficient way to get to the optimum. And let me give you an example of that. So consider network externalities for fax machines, right? So everyone who owns a fax machine is better off when other people have fax machines because they're able to use their machine better. This is called the network externality. And a big problem in getting people to adopt fax machines was that people didn't internalize the externality they were creating on other people who currently had fax machines. But the problem is that when only a couple of people in the world have fax machines, putting a subsidy that's equal to the marginal externality would be tiny. Because the total amount of externality that any additional person getting a fax machine would be very, very small. Now at the optimum, when a lot of people have fax machines, the marginal externality would be very large. And so what that says is that it doesn't always make sense to impose the marginal externality at that point. You might want to impose something much larger to try to get you to the efficient point. And in fact, this is what a lot of internet companies who own a new technology do, right? They lose money early on, they subsidize the thing like crazy to get a lot of people on board, and then they make profits later, right? Because they don't just subsidize the marginal externality at that point, they realize that there's some other point that would be better, and that once they get there, they'll just give the marginal externalities the subsidy. And this process where you initially give a big, big discount in order to try to get up to the efficient level, and then just give the marginal discount, is what's called the insulating tariff. Okay, so the most common practical application of externality taxes is taxes on pollution. So a classic example of this is effluent taxes proposed by Lawrence White. So what he proposed was that when you come to get your car inspected, rather than like paying some flat gas tax or being mandated that you have to meet a certain quality standard for smog in your car, smog is not really a problem in small towns, it's only a problem in big towns. So small towns